Hey, this is Brian Wright. This is March 25th, 2026. I haven't posted anything for a while because I got hit with the flu. I was down for the count. Man, it really kicked my ass. Yesterday was not a fun day, but I woke up today. I'm a little bit tired, but I feel a lot better. The reason I'm throwing out the date is because I've been getting a lot of people are throwing shade at me for things I'm saying and saying that I'm a show for the UFC or, I'm riding Dana, whatever. But the reality of it is, on this day in history, the UFC's top dog. It's top dog by a lot. And when we have arguments about fighter pay, when we have arguments about fair treatment and all these kinds of things, I mean, what are we really talking about? The UFC is the only organization that's 30 plus years old that has been consistently paying athletes better. Everybody else that has tried has gone out of business. They've brought high level talent in. They've paid them more money than the UFC was paying, but then they went out of business because they weren't able to build their brand off of those paydays. Now, part of it is the fact that fighters really don't do that much to help the organizations except fight. You need to have a real brand partnership between athlete and organization to develop the creative and the storylines and all the things necessary to compete in this media driven culture that we have. Francis Ngannou left the UFC. He went to the PFL. He went to boxing. He made a lot of money, personally enriched himself. But the PFL is what? Bought and sold, out of business, in business, restructuring how many times since they brought him on? Their investment in him did not pay off, and ultimately they let him go, and now he's going to Netflix. Netflix has enough money to not go out of business and to, give him some opportunities to make paydays, but there's no big change to culture or sport. Connor was the one that first went to boxing. Ngannou followed that model. Connor actually did it with a partnership with the UFC so that he was able to go and fight Floyd, make a ton of money, build the largest personal brand in all of combat sports, arguably, or at least at the time, and then came back to the UFC. And he's still with the UFC. And he still owns part of Bare Knuckle. And he still has brands that he's doing and all this stuff. I mean, Connor is the one. I don't know necessarily if he's changed the game, but he did create a blueprint that others can follow. Francis Ngannou didn't create any blueprints. Francis Ngannou didn't do anything right by the industry. He did a lot of things that were right for himself. I don't fault him for any of it. But to sit here and claim that, he's a game changer, he's causing people to have more respect or different things, it's nonsense. He basically took his talents on the road, partnered up with people that had the funds to give him the money that he wanted, and he's been putting on shows. He's not involved in the sport of MMA or boxing. He's involved in the spectacle aspect of MMA and boxing. And again, why not? That's where the money was for him. He ran the sport as far as he could, made as much as he could, and then he went to the spectacle side, and he's crushing it. Great, fantastic. But don't pretend that you're changing the game. You have very few athletes that have had the ability to walk away from the juggernaut that is the UFC, to disassociate themselves with that name and to do much with it. Demetrius Johnson did it. Eddie Alvarez did it to a degree. The big one to me that stands out, uh, it's not the largest story, but if you look at Corey Anderson, he's somebody I have personal history with. I know the man. Uh, this is a guy that always looked at things from the angle of how is this going to benefit me? And in a sport like MMA, where you could get chewed up and spit out and not make that much, the attitude in which he brought to the table was perfect for him. He had the audacity to do it his way. The UFC and him didn't really get along. He didn't feel like he was being treated fairly. So he used his talents and he used his connections and he moved over to Bellator and he got paid really, really well. And he won a belt and he did his thing. And now I guess that's transferred over to the PFL. Who knows what they'll do with him there. But this is a guy that's found a tremendous amount of personal success, greater than probably what the UFC would have provided for him. And yeah, for a guy with a family and his own dreams and aspirations, fantastic. Great job. I think Corey actually created more of a blueprint for athletes than, say, Francis did. Francis was in a unique position, being the heavyweight champ of the world with the notoriety that he had and whatever. Corey is somebody that, top 5 talent consistently in the UFC, an ultimate fighter champion. moves on, becomes a Bellator champion. I'm not going to say he's not a household name. I think most people are aware of who he is, but he's not Francis Ngannou level known. But he did leverage his body of work into a very good personal situation, and more power to him. And it all came down to the one thing, which was he wasn't afraid to walk away from the association with the UFC brand. His brand was strong enough for him to go and do what he wanted. And that's, if you're going to have a takeaway and you're going to want to sit here and you want to analyze and you're going to look at like, okay, what's the blueprint? If I don't want to be a UFC fighter and I still want to do something, what do I do? Okay, you either go and start a YouTube channel and try and become the next Jake Paul and then go pure spectacle, or do what Corey did. You develop a personal brand, you provide that brand to an organization that has the funds to back you, has enough people to challenge you so you can consistently get work, and you do your thing. But you've got to look at the numbers and not worry about the associations, because you're the one who's going to take the damage. You're the one who's going to have to live with the efforts. So if the UFC is where you feel you're going to be best served, where you're going to get the most attention, the most opportunity, and develop the best career, go for it. But if you're one of the unique people that has a personal brand that goes beyond the UFC and you can develop things elsewhere, and that's what you want to do, fine, go for it. But always, you have to be a company person while you're in a company, but you also have to be an individual and you have to take care of yours. And I completely get that. So when I'm spitting out the real facts about March of 2026, about the real numbers, about the real way the sport's functioning, I mean, you may not like the fact that the UFC is top dog right now, but stop getting mad at me about it. I didn't do it. I'm just reporting what's actually happening out there. The UFC is the only organization that for 30 years has continually paid people better. There's no other way to say it. No fighter in the UFC has made less money than the fight before. If they lose, they make the same money. If they win, they make better money. It's been this way for over 30 years. And then you complain, okay, they can't have their own sponsors. Sure, but when they took away sponsors, fighter pay went up dramatically, and fighters still can go get sponsors. They just can't wear them in the octagon. So if you have a personal brand, if you have a story that you can tell, look at Sean O'Malley. I think Sean O'Malley makes more a month than he does in the UFC off of his personal brand, and he's developing his own businesses, and he has his own relationships and Twitch channels and all that stuff. You know, those opportunities didn't go away. They didn't change. You just can't rock it in the octagon. And you're still getting paid for wearing the Venom stuff, and you're still getting paid if you get a Monster sponsorship, and now they have Aviator paying guys. So there's still a lot of money to be made. And if there wasn't, people wouldn't be fighting in the organization and they'd be going elsewhere. But currently, in March of 2026, there is no other organization that is providing a platform with the consistency that the UFC has been providing. Maybe that'll change. MVP is not that change, for sure. PFL is being restructured. They have a new CEO. They're talking about doing things. Maybe in time, that will be a consistent place for people to go, get paid, develop their brands. Let's see where their TV deal goes. But, you know, things like MVP, they're great and they're needed. I'm not throwing shade on it when I say it's a spectacle side of the business. There's spectacle and there's sport. The UFC is a league. It is the sport. It has a little bit of spectacle, but they use it strategically. So the spectacle side is when you take somebody that's not a challenger for a title anymore, but they have brand recognition. So a guy like Conor. Is Conor going to be champ again? I don't think so. But he has enough of a fan base and a track record to pretend that he's a title challenger. So he is the perfect opportunity to bring in, to develop somebody else that's actually a title contender and to sell a lot of tickets, bring a lot of eyeballs to the sport. So that's what traditionally would be called a gatekeeper. That's somebody that is good, not as good as they once were. They have a lot of name value, and there's somebody that you can springboard another name off of. You can sell a lot of tickets in the process, and you can keep the organization brand developing as well. So that's a perfect storm of sport and spectacle and business all coming together. But then you have MVP under Jake Paul and his partners, and now Netflix. That is 100% spectacle. There's no road to anything except personal riches there, which is fine. I think it's a phenomenal way for a fighter on the way up on the undercard to get known, and for a fighter that is kind of run their course to go get a big payday on the way out. I think Mike Perry and Nate Diaz is my favorite fight on the upcoming show because I think they're both entertaining warriors that don't have championship potential in, say, a UFC. Mike Perry probably has championship potential for BKFC. And if he ever is allowed to fight in his own promotion of dirty boxing, I think he's a tough go for anybody. But in regards to MMA, he's kind of out of the top 5 talk anywhere. But him and Nate are incredibly entertaining fighters. I think they are men that put their bodies on the line for our entertainment in a way that deserves a good paycheck and deserves a promotion like MVP. Ronda Rousey, Gina Carano, pure spectacle. I don't really care who wins. I'm interested to how it goes. Let them get paid again on the way out. Ronda's super salty. I don't know why. I guess she's selling the fight. She's become a WWE style heel in MMA. Ngannou versus his opponent, whose name escapes me. I guess it just helps the fans that hate the UFC and think that Francis is the linear or whatever heavyweight champ. Give him his shot, whatever. And then we'll talk about maybe John Jones is going to leave the UFC and fight Francis one day. I kind of hope that happens. I hope John gets the opportunity to fight him. But again, it's pure spectacle. That is pure entertainment. There's no big talk of anything after it. It's just that individual event. These people are going to make a lot of money individually. They're going to entertain us on one night. But what? MVP, what they do, 2 or 3 events a year. They'll talk shit the entire time about how the UFC sucks and they're so much better and they're like going to save the sport. No, they're not. They're going to have a handful of people on there that'll make some money, get their name out there. And again, it has its place. It even has its need. I think guys should have a place to go cash out like that. I don't think it's the UFC's responsibility to create spectacle events like that. I think the UFC's job is to create a pipeline of people that are going to challenge for the title. And that's what keeps it a league and a sport. You know, the NFL doesn't have a retirement tour. They don't have old players coming out and, you know, it's not like a senior PGA league. It's always the youngest, the best that are all putting teams together that are trying to get to the Super Bowl. The UFC Super Bowl or all the belts. It needs to stay that way. And again, if there's going to be spectacle, it's for the gatekeepers to challenge the young guys and help them springboard their careers into title contention. And then MVP is literally just a place for people to go and entertain us, for us to get those fantasy matches, let them all get paid very well, let them put some money in the bank and, you know, go off into retirement better than they would have been. You know, the ecosystem does work. It needs some more structure, but all these arguments that the fighters keep having and then the fans keep pouring gasoline on it is part of the problem. For the UFC ever to become an NFL or an NBA, you will have to have a fighters association. You will have to have qualifications for managers that go beyond the fact that you just happen to represent these fighters, because there's no legal requirement to be a manager outside of the fighter agrees to let you make calls for them. And then you agree to pay them a percentage of your money in exchange for that. The NFL, you have to have a certain level of education. You have to pass a test. You have to be certified. I think MMA and boxing in a lot of ways need to do something along those lines where you have some kind of regulation or at least qualification to become a manager beyond, you know, somebody asked me to make a phone call. And that's a lot of the disservice that happens, where a lot of the abuse happens, because you have a lot of guys that came into the sport to be managers that were not prepared to be managers. And then they become powerful because they have a stable, and then they have the right phone numbers and the right relationships to keep everything rolling along. The organizations take a little bit of advantage of the fact that a lot of these managers are not really professional people and they're making their money. And again, it's like, Everybody's being held hostage to the finances. Guys are afraid to speak out against the UFC because they don't want to get cut. Managers are afraid to push too hard for deals because they don't want to get blackballed. There's a lot of weirdness going on. Um, Structuring the organization is a win-win for everybody. So if the organization would stick to its rankings, if the managers had better qualifications, and if the fighters would, I guess, have a system they could trust and then actually trust it, everything would be better. But it is fight sports. It is a little chaotic. You know, everybody's constantly in that position of they feel like they should be getting paid better. Then there's always the whispers of it's greener on the other side. But just look at it. Again, it's March 25th, 2026. And the UFC for 30 years has consistently grown, has consistently paid. It hasn't missed a paycheck. You have all the other organizations that have come and gone that said they were going to put them out of business because they were going to pay better, whatever. And you have tons of fighters that are still waiting for checks from 10 years ago. And you have guys that were promised massive futures that just never happened because the organizations didn't have the deals. They didn't have the infrastructure. They didn't have TV and media and product and all the things that are necessary to have multi-million-dollar organizations and now billion-dollar organizations. Boxing's different. You compare MMA to boxing, it's rough because in boxing, 80% of the proceeds go to the fighters, but these promoters aren't putting on a massive amount of events a year. The promoters themselves, they make their millions off of a couple of events and they're good. They're not employing 800 fighters and an army of employees. They're cutting short-term deals to create short-term money over and over and over again. League situations are totally different. Those are machines that you're putting out content weekly. You're, driving profits daily, publicly traded now. So you have different responsibilities. It's all pretty clear if you look at it. You just have to get out of the pride never dies mentality. Pride got bought by the UFC and got shut down. WEC got absorbed by the UFC and got shut down. Strikeforce got bought by the UFC and got shut down. All these organizations in the past that were supposed to be the next big thing all came and went because the promoters didn't really want to build anything. They just wanted to use the adversarial relationship with the UFC to develop a fan base, to pull fighters in, and to pretend like they were going to do big things. There was never big things on the table for any of them. It was always just smoke and mirrors. The UFC was the only one that was investing in infrastructure. The other people were just bleeding the market of money and getting fighters to fight for them for a limited amount of time. And again, most of the fighters from the organizations that I mentioned ended up fighting in the UFC. And they had nice careers there, and they probably made more money in the UFC than they did in any of those other organizations. So there's the real world where the UFC is top dog, and then there's everybody else. And then there's that fantasy online, I'm salty, Dana's a dick, the UFC sucks world where they're putting out fake memes like yesterday, my feed just got pounded with the UFC no longer pays for anybody except the fighter plus their head coach. As if this was new. I've been going to the UFC for 15, 16 years, and it's never been different. They always only paid for the fighter and won, and the other cornermen were always their responsibility. It's just always been that way. A fighter gets 2 plane tickets, 1 hotel room, and everything else comes out of their fight purse. For most people, that is covered by the Venom money now. So it's not as if this massive amount of money is coming out of fighters' pockets. It's not like Fight Week has gotten more complicated. They're not paying guys less, not taking care of less things or any of that. The UFC is doing what the UFC has always done, and it's fake news otherwise. So, real world is what it is. Can't change reality. You got to accept it. And then if you want to change it, you've got to structurally work to change it. But this whole bickering and bantering as if it's something else is kind of ridiculous, but the internet's always going to internet and people are always going to have their opinions. I like to deal with facts and figures because facts and figures don't have opinions. And the reality is the reality. So I'll just end with one take on the reality so you don't think I'm complete UFC shill. The percentage of money the UFC pays the athletes is way too low. I 100% agree. But you have to temper that with the decisions that the fight community makes. The UFC clearly could fire the entire roster today and then take their media machine and rebuild it with a bunch of people you've never heard of and still find the same level of success within a matter of probably weeks, if not months, because the UFC's media machine can create stars on demand at a level enough to keep the machine rolling along. Not a Conor level star, not maybe a Pereira or a John Jones, because those were things that were built off remarkable achievements. Those three men are men that pound for pound in their moments were the best. They were finishing people creatively and violently at the right times against the right names to develop brand, which the UFC catapulted into the Paramount deal, and then will then have another wave of guys that are going to do amazing things, and the machine will keep moving along. So, yeah, the fighters, the problem we have is that for every fighter with this itch in the back of their head that we should get paid better, realizes that there's nowhere else to get paid better and that it's a death sentence for their career if they leave in today's moment, and that there's probably 100 guys for every spot on the roster ready to take less money than guys are getting paid now just to be able to say that they're UFC fighters. That's how strong the brand is. People are willing to fight basically for free so that they can say that they were a UFC fighter, because they feel in their mind being a UFC fighter is the thing that's going to change their life. It can. For most, it won't. For most, actually, it probably just extends their adolescence and put them in a position where at 30 years old, they're going to have to make life decisions they should have made at like 18 or 19. But that's the pessimist coach in me. But again, the reality of it is the UFC brand is just, it's the juggernaut. That is the elephant in the room. That's the biggest, baddest situation we've got going. And the only way for fighters to change what we know is kind of working, can't say it's not working. It's 100% working, or it wouldn't be what it is and the fighters wouldn't be doing it. But to make it better requires organization, requires structure, and it really will require regulation. Managers need to be regulated 100%. The UFC has to be put in a position where there's collective bargaining within the fight community and managers that are operating within a rule structure, and then pay and percentages and profit sharing off of the, name, image, likeness, products, all these things has to be worked out. It's totally doable, but the UFC has the really big problem of, as a publicly traded company, they have a fiduciary responsibility to the shareholders to make as much money as possible. So you have to come up with a system that the increased pay to fighters, the increase of percentage to fighters can be justified because the overall bottom line will increase. The UFC is making a lot of cash right now. Wall Street loves the return. It's way bigger than most sports leagues, if not all sports leagues from a percentage wise. But that bottom line could be expanded if there was a greater partnership between the athlete and the organization, so that the products, the media that's created, all the different profitable opportunities were shared appropriately across the board. Fighters can make a lot more money than fight night. They can make money off of all the other things the UFC does, and the UFC can expand its outreach into the amount of things it sells. I mean, t-shirts are a massive business. If the fighters in the UFC work together more, the clothing product alone could probably triple, and the UFC can make that much more money, and they can increase their bottom line, and then they could justify the investment in the athletes that much more. But the athletes have to make the commitment to behaving in a particular way, to operating as more, say, company men, and the company has to support these men. And, we just need some rules and some structure and some regulation. It's really that simple. So this is Brian Wright. I'm a coach. You don't have to like my perspective, but I haven't said anything here that's not true. This is all real. It's all facts and figures and history, guys. Um, if you don't like the UFC, that's fine, but don't pretend the UFC is doing all this bad stuff that it's not. It's not doing the good stuff, I guess, to the degree it could, but we have to justify to Wall Street and Main Street that the investment is going to pay off. And if we do that, we'll see it grow. But to get the UFC into a position to do that, the fighters will have to, I hate to use that word unionize, but they will have to put themselves in a collective bargaining situation. But that requires the managers, the fighters are going to have to get along, and they're going to have to present themselves in a way that's going to show greater profits to Wall Street. And Wall Street is what is going to be controlling the UFC as a publicly traded entity for the future to come. All right, Brian Wright. Peace.